Let's face it, our minds are tricky things. They're constantly working, processing, and trying to make sense of the world. But sometimes they do lead us astray. I don't mean in an obvious way, like forgetting where you left your keys. I'm talking about the subtle, sneaky mental errors we make every day that shape our decisions, actions, and ultimately our lives. I'm not pointing fingers here. I'm guilty of this too. And honestly, the more I learn, the more common mental mistakes I catch myself doing and falling into them. But the good news is, once you recognize these patterns, you can actually start to push back against them. It's not about being perfect, because come on, none of us are, but it's about giving yourself the tools to make better choices and see things more clearly. Anchoring. When the first impression takes control. Anchoring happens when the first piece of information we receive, like a price, an idea, or an opinion, becomes the baseline for how we evaluate everything else. It's a mental shortcut that can heavily influence our decisions, even if the inflow of information isn't entirely relevant. For instance, if you're shopping for a car and the first one you see costs 50 grand, that number sets the tone. Suddenly, a 40 grand car feels like a steal, even if it's not what you need, and then like a 70 grand car kind of seems overpriced, regardless of its value. Anchoring doesn't apply to prices, it affects negotiations, goals, and even perceptions of success. One time I found myself anchored to one of these luxury resort prices when I was planning a trip. Even though we switched to like the more budget-friendly options, everything still felt underwhelming compared to those initial extravagant ideas. That first impression skewed my perspective, making it harder to see the value in a perfectly good alternative. The first step to combat anchoring is awareness. Ask yourself, is this anchor relevant? Seek additional information to create a fuller picture, and then set your own benchmarks before encountering external influences. For example, researching typical prices or setting expectations before negotiations can help you resist from being swayed by an unrealistic anchor. Anchoring is natural, but it doesn't have to control your decisions. By recognizing its influence and stepping back, you can evaluate options more thoroughly. Remember, the first impression is just one piece of the puzzle. It doesn't have to define your choice. Confirmation bias. The echo chamber in our heads. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information that supports what we already believe while ignoring evidence that challenges it. It's like we're living in a mental echo chamber where our own opinions are constantly reinforced, often at the expense of growth and understanding. We've experienced it all, scrolling through articles, clicking through only the ones that confirm our perspective, or misinterpreting somebody's actions to align with a perceived notion. While this feels validating in the moment, this bias narrows our viewpoint and keeps us from fully understanding the world around us. In relationships, confirmation bias can lead us to fixate on evidence that supports our assumptions. If you think someone dislikes you, you'll likely notice behaviors that seem to confirm it, while ignoring the actions that suggest otherwise. The same happens with news and opinions. If you only consume content that aligns with your beliefs, it strengthens your views but limits your ability to understand other perspectives. Breaking out of this cycle requires intentional effort. Start by seeking out information that challenges your beliefs, approaching it with curiosity rather than defensiveness. You gotta ask yourself, could they have a point that I hadn't considered? Gathering feedback from diverse voices also helps, as others can offer insights you may not have noticed. Overcoming confirmation bias doesn't mean abandoning your beliefs. It means being open to questioning them. By stepping out of the echo chamber and engaging with different perspectives, you open yourself to growth and better decision making. Challenge your assumptions and see what you can learn. It's uncomfortable, but it's often transformative. The availability heuristic. When the loudest voice wins. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut where our brains give more weight to vivid, recent, or emotionally charged information, often at the expense of a valid view. It leads us to overestimate the importance of what's easiest to recall, even if it's not the most accurate or representative. Take plane crashes, for example. They're rare, but dramatic coverage can make them feel far more common than they are. Meanwhile, everyday risks, like driving, don't evoke the same emotional reaction because they lack the vividness to stick in our minds. This bias also shows up in everyday decisions. Imagine reading one detailed negative review about a product despite dozens of positive ones. That vivid critique may dominate your perception, not because it's representative, because it's more memorable. I experienced this firsthand when working with Blakebill, where a single harsh critique about a feature made me question my whole work, even though most of the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. It took stepping back and realizing that the vivid complaint was the outlier. In relationships, the availability heuristic can make us focus on a single recent mistake rather than a long history of positive behavior. Similarly, in decision-making, one vivid story about a failure can overshadow statistic realities about success. To counter this bias, step back and ask, is this example truly representative, or is it just the most striking? Seek multiple perspectives to gain a balanced view. For example, when reviewing feedback, I learned to focus on the collective data rather than the isolated instances. The availability heuristic isn't inherently bad. It helps us process information quickly. But for important decisions, it's worth slowing down and ensuring the loudest voice doesn't drown out the bigger picture. Thoughtful, balanced choices often require looking beyond what's easiest to remember. Loss aversion. Why we're afraid to let go. Loss aversion is the human tendency to fear losses more than we value gains. Losing $50 feels worse than finding $50 feels good, even though the amounts are the same. This bias affects more than just money. It influences our decisions, relationships, and habits, often keeping us stuck in situations that no longer serve us. We cling to what's familiar because the thought of losing feels like failure. This fear often leads to the sunk cost fallacy, where we continue investing in something because of what we've already put into it, even if letting go is a smarter choice. For example, people stay in unfulfilling relationships or persist with failing projects because they don't want to waste the time or the energy they've already spent. I've experienced this personally. I once kept working on a project that clearly wasn't gaining traction simply because I didn't want to admit that the time and effort I had put into it hadn't paid off. It wasn't until I reframed the situation, focusing on what I could have gained by shifting my energy elsewhere, that I found the courage to actually let it go. To overcome this loss aversion, you got to start by reframing loss as an opportunity. Ask yourself, what can I gain by letting go? Recognize sunk costs for what they are. Investments that can't be recovered. Decisions should focus on the future, not on the past. Talking to others actually helps too. Outside perspectives often highlight opportunities or insights we miss when we're too focused on avoiding loss. Letting go isn't failure, it's a way to make space for growth and better opportunities. Loss aversion is a natural part of being human, but when we recognize its influence, we can shift our mindset. Loss isn't the enemy, it's often the first step towards something better. By moving through the fear, we open ourselves to transformation and growth. The overconfidence effect. When you think you know more than you do. Confidence is important. It helps us take action and tackle challenges. But overconfidence, where we overestimate our abilities or knowledge, often leads to mistakes. It's the reason we assume we're better drivers than average. We believe we're prepared for situations when we're not, or think we can predict outcomes with certainty. Overconfidence feels good because it gives us a sense of control, but it can blind us to risks of complexity or the possibility of being wrong. I've experienced this firsthand. Early in my career, I took on a project without fully preparing because I thought I had it covered. It quickly became clear I wasn't as ready as I believed, turning what could have been a smooth process into a stressful catch-up game. This bias showed up when I was building Blakebill. I assumed I knew what I wanted for freelancers based on my own intuition and limited research. It wasn't until I started listening to real user feedback that I realized how much I missed. Overconfidence had made me overlook critical pain points and opportunities for improvement. Overconfidence can also make us resistant to feedback, keeping us from considering alternative perspectives. It often leads to underestimating risks as we take on challenges without adequate preparation, increasing the likelihood of avoidable failures. To counteract overconfidence, you got to start with humility. Accept that there's always more to learn and approach situations with curiosity rather than certainty. Seek diverse perspectives and feedback to identify blind spots and adjust your approach. So, for example, user feedback I had during Blakebill development helped me define the platform into something that was far more effective. Adopting a mindset of preparation also helps. Instead of assuming readiness, ask yourself, what don't I know? What could go wrong? Anticipating potential gaps or obstacles ensure better decisions and adaptability. Overconfidence isn't inherently bad. It can push us to take risks. But when balanced with humility and openness to learning, it leads to smarter decisions and sustained growth. True confidence comes from knowing you're willing to learn, not from thinking you know it all. The framing effect. How presentation changes everything. The framing effect shows how the way information is presented. Its frame can shape our perceptions and decisions even when the underlying facts remain the same. Subtle differences in wording or context can invoke an entirely different emotional response, influencing how we interpret or react. For example, imagine two packages of ground beef. One says 90% lean and the other says 10% fat. They're identical, but the 90% lean label feels healthier because it's framed positively. This effect isn't limited to product labels. It appears in marketing, politics, healthcare, everyday life. A doctor might say a treatment has a 90% success rate, which feels reassuring, but say it has a 10% failure rate, it suddenly feels much riskier, even though the information is exactly the same. Framing can also influence communication in relationships. Saying, I need more time to think, feels thoughtful, while I'm not ready to decide might feel uncertain or dismissive, even though they both convey hesitation. The subtle differences in language can change how messages are received and interpreted. To counteract the framing effect, pause and focus on the facts rather than presentation. Ask yourself, am I reacting to how this is framed, or do I understand the actual details? Reframing the situation can help too. If a decision feels emotionally charged, flip the frame. For example, if a discount is framed as saving $10, consider how it feels when it's framed as spending $90. This shift can help you evaluate more objectively. The framing effect isn't inherently good or bad. It's a part of how our brains process information. By being mindful of it, you can avoid being overly influenced by how something something is presented, making clear decisions, and communicate more effectively with others. Recognizing this bias gives you the power to see through the frame and focus on the reality behind it. Why this all matters. Understanding mental biases like the framing effect, confirmation bias, or loss aversion is a powerful step forward in better decision making and intentional living. These biases often influence our choices without us realizing, shaping how we see the world, interacting with others, and pursuing our goals. Recognizing them allows us to pause, reflect, and make decisions that align with our true values. For example, the framing effect can sway us with clever marketing or emotional appeals, making us focus on presentation over facts. Awareness of this bias helps us ask better questions and make more informed choices. Similarly, confirmation bias can keep us stuck in echo chambers, limiting growth. By actively seeking diverse perspectives, we can expand our understanding and make more balanced choices. Biases like loss aversion hold us back by making us afraid to let go of unproductive projects or relationships. Recognizing this fear allows us to focus on potential gains, opening the door for new opportunities. This awareness also improves how we communicate and interact with each other. Understanding these patterns help us approach situations with empathy and clarity, fostering better relationships and collaboration. On a personal level, it helps us to be kinder to ourselves, seeking mistakes not as failures, but as natural tendencies of the mind. By understanding these biases, we move from reacting on autopilot to acting with intention. While we can't eliminate these mental shortcuts entirely, recognizing them allows us to live and decide with greater purpose and clarity.